sorry for the delay. It's a post-fight reaction between Captain Albert Buhl and Lothar von Richthofen, younger brother, of course, of Manfred von Richthofen. It's the 7th of May 1917. Just a little background on Albert Buhl, who's 20 years of age. He's our leading ace. He is credited with 44 victories by this point, and he has a reputation of being something of a maverick. He doesn't really like leading his flight and keeping the squadron together and working as a team, although everyone in his squadron admires him. But he much prefers, a little bit like Billy Bishop, he much prefers going off doing his own thing, going out hunting Germans on his own. And also the way in which he fights. He's not following the Bolke Dicta. He's not observing the rules to try and keep himself safe and shoot down enemies from the safest way possible for oneself. No, that's not how he fights. He has a reputation of going out, returning with an aircraft riddled with bullets, and in his letters back home to his girlfriend, he often writes about how he feels he must be protected by God, because he comes home with so many holes in his machine, and yet he's untouched. And in fact, there's one where he comes home and he says, good day today. I only had 8 holes left in my machine after the combat. So apparently that's a good day. We only get hit 8 times. So, as well, his manner of fighting, very aggressive, head-on kind of approach. And what he does, he uses an attack that, I don't know if he coined the phrase or whether we have subsequently, but the balls up approach. So what he does is he has a Lewis gun on the top of his machine, mounted on the top wing, and he'll dive below an opponent, he'll pull the gun down, or pull the handle down, so the thing swings up, and then he'll rake the opponent right through the belly. And that's his method of attack. And indeed, even when he gets the synchronised Vickers gun firing through the propeller, he has it removed and says, could you just fit me Lewis gun back on the top wing? That's what worked for him. He liked to just dive under, swing it up. That was what he liked to do. Later on, he did have both, I believe, when he got an SE5 and is a bit more powerful. I think he had a synchronised Vickers firing straight and also a separate Lewis gun sat on the top wing. And he would switch between aircraft. And also, he was a tinkerer. He understood mechanics. And so he'd souped up his new plane. He didn't like the SE5 when it arrived. He tinkered with it a lot and got it to his liking, like a bigger fuel tank and, different bits and bobs here and there that he was able to get a little bit more speed out of it and so on. Removed an armour plate that he didn't think was necessary that was weighing the plane down. A bit about Lothar von Richthofen, obviously brother of Manfred von Richthofen, Freiherr, which I think is, you could say Freiherr von Richthofen, Freeman, I guess would be the translation, because they're aristocratic. All of them are entitled to use that sort of appellation. From Breslau, of course, in East Prussia. And, aristocratic family, grew up hunting, riding horses, doing all that stuff, same as Manfred, but very different to Manfred. Excellent shot, obviously, because of all the hunting he did as a child, but he's not the careful tactician that Richthofen is. He's much more like Albert Buhl, actually. Has a reputation for just balling into the fray and just, taking people head on, going into the heart of the action. He's not one of these people like his brother was, sort of stalking the easy victims and taking them out from a place of safety behind his own lines. And Lothar's much more aggressive. But anyway, on this day, 7th of May 1917, he's with the 56th Squadron, I think, is Albert Buhl's squadron at this time. He's returned to the front fairly recently, having had a long period at home because he was just combat fatigued. And you could tell this by the way he was speaking in some of his letters, that he was feeling the pressure of the war, and his emotions are up and down, up and down. But anyway, on this day, he gets into combat. It's evening now. They're all low on fuel. He's low on fuel, but he does have a larger petrol tank fitted. That was one of his tinkerings. But they see the enemy, the red planes of, what we assume is a Richthofen. And he goes into combat. I think Richthofen is an Albatros D3, whereas Buhl is in an SE5A. both of them excellent aircraft, but the Albatross a little more heavily armoured in the sense, or armed I should say, in the sense it has 2 forward-firing synchronised Spandaus firing through the propeller. They go for one another, as you'd expect. The rest of the patrol, it's all been broken up, and in fact most of them are returning to base because they're so low on fuel. But Bull and Richthofen just go for one another, and they start circling around, doing all the aerobatics you'd expect from these 2 excellent pilots, and neither can get the upper hand. The aircraft is similarly matched, and their skills are similarly matched, and neither can get a shot off on the other. They just keep turning big, wide, banking turns, maybe diving up, down, just trying everything they can to get a bead on their opponent, and presumably Bull probably trying to duck beneath Richthofen if he can and get a burst into his belly, which was his favourite attack. But they can't. They just can't get a bead on one another. Everyone thinks that this is the end of it because it's getting so dark, they need to break for home, and indeed they do. They both break. They turn away from the fight because they need to get home. But then, both of them swing back around again and fly headlong at one another. Neither of them is willing to concede a draw. And they fire at one another. It's a test of marksmanship. They both fly past one another. Neither is hit. They swing around again and just fly headlong at one another again. Another burst of fire, but no apparent effect. Third burst of fire on the third pass, just directly flying at one another. Richthofen dives and turns, and he has in fact to make an emergency landing. His petrol tank has been shot through, but he's unharmed. Bull also falls and dives, disappears into the clouds. No one can see what's happened, and unfortunately Albert Bull at the age of 20 was dead. It's an interesting story, and that was the German propaganda story, that Lothar beat Albert. The German fought against a brave enemy, but the German prevailed, as they always do, and that was the German propaganda story. And indeed, we should say the Germans were very respectful to Albert Bull's body when they found the plane. It landed on their side of the line, and they gave him, I don't know about the burial service, funeral service, whatever, but they certainly dealt with him in an appropriate manner and honoured him as a brave soldier, and he wasn't just chucked in a mass grave or anything. But down on the ground there was a lieutenant from the army who had seen the actual crash of what was actually Albert Bull, and unfortunately here is where the official story of the exciting fight proves to unravel a tad. I forget the lieutenant's name, but he was the first one on the scene. He sees falling from a thundercloud, or certainly dark sky, bad weather. He sees the SE5 coming down, and it's upside down, and it's belching a load of black smoke from the engine, and it comes out the cloud, and then suddenly there's just clear air, no time to do anything, smashes into the ground. He runs up, he tries to administer first aid to Bull, to be fair. This is not someone who's going to abuse an injured pilot. He's obviously a respectable man. He goes to Albert Bull, but sadly Albert Bull is mortally wounded. He's got a crushed chest, he's got a broken back, I believe a broken leg as well. But interestingly, what they did, apparently he was cradled he wasn't immediately dead. He died over the next few minutes, and apparently a French lady ran up and cradled him in her arms for the last moments of his life, which I'm sure is lovely. But what a horrible thing to happen. What the lieutenant said, though, was interesting. He said they examined the plane. They couldn't find any damage, any battle damage whatsoever, except one machine gun hole through the breech of the gun. That was all they could find, through the breech of... the Vickers had been shot through, but I believe he still had the Lewis on top anyway. So it did appear there'd been one hit to the gun, but they couldn't find anything else. Now, they immediately transported Albert Bull to the field hospital, partly because maybe they hoped he could be saved, but also for a post-mortem and so on. And I should have said the lieutenant checked him over immediately, checked his papers, and knew this was the famous British ace. They used to call him the English Richthofen. They took him to a field hospital, and as we know from the post-mortem on Manfred, when he was killed later, they used to just stick a wire coat hanger into any bullet holes to see how deep they go and where they go. But there were none on Albert Bull. He appeared to have no bullet wounds whatsoever. So the question was, what even caused this crash? Unfortunately, those early models of the SE5A had a reputation for the carburetors flooding. This doesn't sound dissimilar to the Second World War on a Spitfire, does it? When you try and dive. They had a reputation for the carburetors flooding, and the engine would cut out, which is fine if you're high up in the air. You can sort that out, and you can use that altitude, swap that for speed and energy. You know, you can recover from that. But he was in a cloud at the time, and this was again the lieutenant's view. He said, what I believe happened, most likely he said, he went into that cloud, diving away from his squadron, possibly attacking Richthofen, possibly not, whatever, and he got disorientated and got flipped upside down, and his carburetor flooded, and he didn't maybe even know he was upside down, but as soon as he emerged from the cloud and could finally get his bearings, it was just too late, because the aircraft was upside down. It smashed into the ground. Interestingly, Lothar von Richthofen afterwards did put in a claim for a kill at the right time, but he said he'd shot down a Sopwith triplane. Now, Lothar von Richthofen knew the difference between an SE5 and a Sopwith triplane, so it would appear it was just German propaganda claiming that actually it was Lothar that did it, because he emphatically was not in a triplane. But yeah, tragic demise for Albert Bull, just 20 years old, leading British ace. And it turned out he unfortunately was not protected by God. He'd just been lucky. And of course, it wasn't sustainable, his manner of fighting. The reality was, if he continued that way of just frantically attacking the enemy on his lonesome, he would, you know, this was what was going to happen. But it's, you know, as so often the way in war, it wasn't the enemy that dealt for him, most likely. It would appear the enemy was the weather. And it just reminds me of all of those. We had a load of pilots, including George Burling, who I've spoken about on this channel before, in Malta in the Second World War, our leading ace, Canadian ace, flying back. There's loads of them, all on a transport plane. I think it was a Dakota. And they're flying back to Gib, as they called it, Gibraltar. And if you know anything about Gibraltar, where you got the rock, and then you got the weather coming up from Africa, and then you got the weather of Spain, you find you get incredible swirling winds, and in particular when you go in and out of the shadow of the rock, you can get some crazy swirling turbulence. And their plane was taken down by the weather. That transport flight ended up in the sea, and all these pilots that had survived battling Germans and Italians all those months in Malta, many of them drowned. George Burling got out, a couple of others got out, but many drowned, along with other different people being shipped back. And it's so often the way, you keep reading this, that not killed by combat, killed by an accident. And that's what happened to McCudden as well. Again, SE5 took off with it when he was back to the front, you know, took off, and it would appear that he suffered again a flood of the carburetor, and because he was so near the ground, he'd just taken off. He actually came down to ask for directions to the correct aerodrome, and it flooded, engine cut out, crashed into the trees, and I believe in his case he wasn't wearing a seatbelt, which might have saved him, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, end of video.